Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Extraordinary Technology Conference 2017, My How Time Flies. This evening, I'm going to be introducing you to a speaker who's going to be talking on a subject very near and dear to my heart, Dr. John Rahart. He's going to be speaking on ORMUS, ORMES, State, and all the same stuff with different names. He hails from a little town south of Albuquerque, and he used to work with, he worked with John Milewski for about 7 years on his superlight elements. He's carrying on that work in the present with the non-metallic elements on that side of things. He's retired from a position in oral surgery, so please welcome John Rahart.
Oh, I need the laser and the clicker. Yep. Alrighty. Okay. First slide. Anyway, we like to pretend we know what we're doing. Anyway, today I'll talk about my goals a little bit more in a minute or so, but there's confusion at times of names ORMUS, ORMES, and the State. I'm going to try to get the broader picture of what these things are, where they fit in, what they relate to, and how they all interrelate to universal processes right across the board. And in respect for John Milewski, who's an absolute genius futurist, I incorporate some of his lead-in stuff, which basically is the way he always did it. So you'll possibly see some repetition here as we get into things, but obviously the disclaimer, the material presented for educational research purposes is from my own understanding and integration of a wide and dispersed source or sources, and some of them are unconventional, and I've talked about that in the past. It's my hope that it can be of value to people in here for the understanding of the worlds that we live in, plural intended on that. And no responsibility obviously is accepted for what other people do with information. It's information alone. So this is typical John Milewski. Anybody recognize what this is? If you've been in my presentations before, you already know. Be careful out there. So anyway, but this is typical John. He's got a sense of humor that matches with mine. But anyway, the goals, again, are provide an overview of ORMUS right across the board. What its properties are, what's the research, where is it going, what kind of applications it has. There'll be some references in there, particularly ones that I've shown in the past with some additional new ones. And I incorporated them mainly for people who haven't been here in the past so that they will have at least some kind of photographic record that they can refer to if they decide it's worthwhile enough to procure the DVD. And sources, things like that, we'll cover as applicable. One of the major clearinghouses is Barry Carter's website on ORMUS, subtleenergies.com. A huge compilation of material on there, so massive at this point that a little while back a book was published, and Dave Kane at Humanagold, HUMANNAGOLD, one word, .ca. He's Canadian. In any event, he gave free downloads of that via email if somebody wants the book, and I'll point it out in a minute or two. So I want to get people aligned with some of the sources. This is an excellent book on precipitating ORMUS, the liquid methods. This gives some history that relates it to probable uses, biblical times and before, with some really good sections on descriptions in there. These are some of the other books. So this is the book, the Matrix of Consciousness, that you can get from Dave Kane as a free download. I'm sure he's really a good guy. And the rest of these all cover different aspects of how ORMES fit into some of the different uses. The medical aspects in particular are dear to my heart. I started out with John Malusky, and you'll see towards the end of the presentation the ovens and things we were using to draw the metallic materials back out of the ORMES state. And he's got 3 DVDs that are out on the table. They're only for display, but his cards are there, and if there aren't cards, get a hold of me and I'll get you some more. You can order those direct from him if you feel them worthwhile. His major venue was to pull from the ORMES state into the metallic state. To me, they're much more valuable, and you'll see why as I go through the presentation. Much more valuable in the ORMES state. And an oversimplification would be, it doesn't matter how much gold they bury you with, but if you're healthy and these are applied through medical applications, you could live to be a really comfortable, ripe old age. And so your call on that. So again, I wanted you to just have resources on this, and some of them are repeats. Where'd the name come from? David Hudson coined it. He is the person who rediscovered it. He was a cotton farmer in Arizona and was pouring sulfuric acid on soils that wouldn't grow anything, trying to acidify the alkalinity out there. And they noticed weird substances coming up, and he spent a lot of money, incredible hoops that he jumped through to identify what it was, and it always came back as iron, silicone, and I forgot what the aluminum. And he kept saying, no, this stuff doesn't behave like iron, silicone, or aluminum, and so on and so forth. Well, to make a long story short, he finally got some influence from some labs in Germany that said, you're only burning it in a 15-second arc. For the spectrograph, you need to run it through 300 seconds. And when he did that, all of a sudden, gold, platinum, iridium, and some of these other materials showed up. And we'll explain why that happens in a little bit. But the name isn't totally valid because it represented orbitally rearranged monatomic elements, and what we're finding out is that the name can't be valid because these elements, by definition, or these materials, have to form what's called a Bose-Einstein condensate. And we'll talk more about what that is and why that happens later, but it has to have an even number of Cooper paired electrons, which we'll get into in a minute, as to what they are. If the atom has an odd number of electrons, it forms what's called a fermion, and it can't form the Bose-Einstein condensate, which generates a Meissner field. And I'm going to explain in more detail what all of those things are and how they relate. The point is that it's not monatomic. It can't be across the board because some of the elements don't qualify. At the very least, you're looking at diatom conjunctions and possibly small particle aggregates, but they've got to be small, and we'll show you why in a minute or two. Okay, and anyway, they don't all have even numbers, so on and so forth. And some of the people who have been in my previous presentations are going to see a few repeat slides, but the point today is I want to tie a whole diverse panorama and bring it into focus. Back around 1895, on the early end of this publication span, a guy named Leadbeater and Annie Besant in India did what they called clairvoyant investigations, and the scientists today go gag, gag, and turn all red when you talk about this. But a really interesting story will come up here in just a little bit, and I'll show you. This is what they called the Anu in 1895, and they drew this schematic picture. And their definition of what this is the smallest particle, and it comes in positive and negative or left and right rotation or however you want to define it. But the bottom line is this is the diagram, these are the actual photos from the publications, and the Anu is the smallest particle that can exist in what we call the third dimension. If the particle gets any smaller than that, it does not have the energy to support itself in this density, and it just disappears out of this dimension. If it has a particle size this size or bigger, it has enough what physicists would refer to as mass, and it appears in this dimension. And it's really an important pivot. So here's a thing, I think this was from the 1990s, and it was discovered, and modern physicists call this thing the Compton radius vortex. Any similarities that you guys can pick up at all between these two? This was done clairvoyantly. This was done by modern physical exploration. I don't know the exact method, nuclear magnet, I just don't know. But in any event, it'll tie in a little bit here in a minute with some other stuff I'm going to say. But here's the Compton radius vortex in a schematic form. And let's see, basically we have two things. One is called ordinary space-time, and the other is called exotic space-time. And the ordinary space-time you're sitting in right now in your chairs, and it's what we call the here and now. Exotic space-time is, we're going to show you in a little bit, a whole different venue that you're also immersed in, but your senses don't pick up on it. They just don't register this kind of energy up here. But in this Compton radius vortex, the boundary between these two will become really significant in a minute, because the Anu, or the Compton radius vortex, defines the boundary layer between this dimension and what can exist here in what we call matter, in the form of matter, and what has to exist out of this dimension in what we would recognize as a form of energy, but even matter is a form of energy. We'll cover that in a little bit. So it's unfair to say matter and energy. Matter is really just a different precipitation form of denser energy. But keep in mind this Compton radius vortex. These are diagrams, this is the actual diagram out of the publications that Leadbeater did of a gold atom. And these are not to be confused with what we consider electrons in the periodic table sense, but they were what were called valence funnels by Leadbeater. And the twist that's relevant for all ORMES is that ORMES tend to only form in the category of what they called columnar or dumbbell-shaped atoms. Other shaped atoms that they described don't qualify, and you'll see why in a moment. But how do we get something to go into or out of the ORMES state? Well, this is a normal valence state. And if these are valence funnels, and that bumps up against, say, a chlorine, if it's gold, you're going to have to tempt it with something, some chlorine or some aqua regia or something like that, it's going to form chemical bonds here and here. But they can't touch one another. So basically, it forms chemical bonds as you would expect in the periodic table chemical kinds of format. But if you get this into a really, really high energy state, especially if it's pulsating, and it's changing, it's got directional vectors that change, you can get this thing swaying back and forth enough where these guys can flex and touch these guys. And in that high energy state, when one of these valence funnels touches one of these and joins together, they go into a high spin state. And that high spin state generates what is called a Cooper pairing. And when atoms pair, and Cooper was a physicist, I don't remember the time span, 50, 60, something, I think he got a Nobel Prize for identifying these Cooper paired materials. And they're pivotal materials in quantum physics, and we'll get to that in a minute. So if you have these things flexing and you have it in a moderate to low energy field that can still accomplish something, and you get one of those guys to attach to one of these guys, you still have a Cooper pair, but it's 1 out of 12. If the opposite extreme occurs and the stretching is so violent and it keeps going until they all go into the high spin state, 12 here matched with 12 there, at that point, what I call these things is percent of saturation, where 100% saturated, every one of the available valence funnels is joined into a Cooper pair. And if none of them are joined together, you have the metallic state, or the parent state. Some really, really, really serious stability and behavioral applications are involved with this span of saturation. And again, I'm going to tie all of this and bring it all together in a bigger picture, but I need to give you the increments and some of the definitions of what we're talking about to pull it all together for you. So, ORMES properties always have a high spin state by definition. The high spin state is what forms or pushes the valence material, or Cooper called them electrons, and they behave the same, into paired high spin state configurations. When that happens, a thing called a Bose-Einstein condensate forms. And it's a really fancy name for a little tiny mini wormhole. And that little mini wormhole is a portal between dimensions. And that's how and why these become able to do the things that we're going to talk about. So when that BEC forms, it's a quantum coherent state, which is also known as an entangled state in quantum physics. It's also known as Einstein called it spooky action at a distance. And what happens there is this condensate forms what's called a Meissner field. And if you can think of it as a bubble around these materials that shields these and contains these materials. The bubble that contains them is anti-magnetic. It repels a magnetic field or is repelled by a magnetic field. And that comes into importance later on when we're trying to isolate these materials, because they're slippery. They're not easy to deal with. So the Meissner field is real critical. Think of it as a bubble that surrounds this thing. What's really critical about a Meissner field is everything inside of that bubble is in a quantum coherent state. And anything in a quantum coherent state, in that same quantum coherent state, anywhere else in the universe, surrounded by its own separate bubble, has no time-distance barrier. It's like those two bubbles were merged into a unity right here and now, but they can be at the other side of the universe and here, and everything in that one bubble knows everything that the materials in the other field know. And this is critical for some of the medical applications that we're going to talk about in a little bit. They behave very differently. They are room temperature superconductors, incredibly important for biologic function. You wouldn't be alive right now if they weren't room temperature conductors. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. They may straddle dimensions. There's some argument on this. There's eloquent, in that book that I showed you that's a compilation, but also on the website from Subtle Energies, they show the original weight distribution graph that David Hudson had, I think it was Cornell, but I'm not sure, one of the major universities run. And when they reach a certain point and they precipitate in the burn into the ORMES state, 4/9 of the mass is gone. It's just gone. Where the heck did it go to? So some people are saying, well, 5/9 of that atom or diatom is sitting on this side of the Compton radius vortex. Other people, and then the 4/9 obviously would be in the other dimension, and it's just balanced and straddled in there. I have a little bit of doubt about that because I don't think the Compton radius vortex is that stable. I think it's like a door. You're either in it, in this room, or you're in the next room, but anyway, that's conjecture. There are other possibilities. The Meissner field alone could explain that. Because the Meissner field is anti-magnetic, if you were to have a magnetic surface and then put a scale on top of it and put a magnet with the reverse pole down there, so that, the similar poles, so you have a south and a south facing, and you weigh that magnet before you put it on there, it's going to weigh X amount. You put it on there, and the repulsion force is going to reduce the apparent weight of that magnet. And that's what I think is happening more likely, is the Meissner field is buffering the mass of that through levitation. And we'll see later on that levitation and anti-magnetism is an important property for these ORMES materials. What's really important that we're going to really stress and show you, the research and whatever, is these materials are dispersed all through your body, from the massive organ coverings all the way down to the tiniest little endpoints inside of the cells, with a network of materials that transmits information. And where's that information come from? Well, biologists that are classical say it comes from your DNA. The DNA basically tells the cellular structure how it's going to be constructed. The ribosomes go out and collect proteins and build it. Well, they've proven there isn't enough of that to go around, plus the ribosomes aren't capable of building a lot of non-protein type materials. So there's a big hole in that theory. What's really important is this scaffolding in your body is constructed of certain materials that we're going to talk about later in a lot of detail that tells you how this process occurs. So some of the general behaviors is ORMES is chemically inert. It won't show up on a spectrograph. It doesn't participate in a chemical reactions if it's fully saturated. And we'll come to a potentially funny story later if we have time. But it depends on saturation, how chemically inert it is. But let's talk about, if I don't tell you differently, let's presume I'm talking about fully saturated ORMES. It has a really high spin state of the Cooper electron pairing, quantum coherence, the BEC, spooky action at a distance, entanglement, whatever you want to call it, and the Meissner field with the anti-magnetic properties. Keep that in mind. It's really important that we're going to build on that. That's why ORMUS behaves differently than other matter. Some of the other relationships that exist from historic times, I started in temporal order here. The historic times, back thousands of years, the ancient Eastern Indian sages and whatever indicated there were energy bodies. You have a physical body, the next body out was the etheric body, and they claimed that was the determinate body of how the physical body was formed. Then they have other bodies, astral and in any event. But it's an energy body that they described thousands of years ago. Then I think in the late 50s or in the 50s, David Bohm, an incredible physicist, came up with this theory of the implicate order, and the converse is the explicate order. And the implicate order is an energy design parameter for everything in this dimension, but in a higher vibratory pattern. The explicate order is the chair you're sitting in now in your body, and the ground you walk on, and the people that annoy you, and all the rest of the wonderful things in life. So David Bohm came up with this, and he was a really renowned physicist. He refused to work on the Manhattan Project, was eventually forced out of the country, and did a lot of his research in France because he did not want to participate in that. But anyway, later on, a guy named Rupert Sheldrake comes along, and he's looking at it from, this is pure physics, creation of everything, how it exists. Sheldrake came along and developed this concept of the morphogenic field. And the morphogenic field is strictly biological in terms of how he started to describe it. But it's the exact same thing, just related to living organisms. A little bit later on, Mei-Wan Ho comes along with a biogenic field. Very similar to this, except she is a quantum physicist, biologist, multiple PhD, working out of England, and probably did some work with Sheldrake. But in any event, we're going to talk about a lot of her research because it's absolutely eloquent, and it essentially tells you how you as a higher existence in another dimension know who you are down here. It's how consciousness is sourced from the higher dimensions and put into this biologic realm. And so we'll talk about in some detail some of her research here in a little bit. So I'm trying to draw things together, how these different characteristics came into different kinds of awarenesses and some of their different behaviors. But when you have superconductivity in a living system at room temperature, at physiologic temperatures, it seems to be via the collagen gel state in connective tissues. And this was some really eloquent research. And that connective tissue, as I said, goes from everything from macro tissues way down to the, and I'll show you here in a little bit more detail. But one of the really important things about this is it's goes into a gel-sol state. We'll talk more later. That's a binary system. Anybody else know what a binary system is used for in information communication? Gee, nature beat us to it. In any event, superconductivity will tie into a lot of the specific research, and we'll talk about that in a lot more detail later on. But it's essentially why you're alive, how you know who you are, what is happening, how your body is built, and it's the main reason that you know that now. And when you separate from your physical body, all the evidence indicates that the real you is up there knowing everything that you know now and probably more, and you just shed the body which was constructed by the information coming from there to here. And that's going to ruffle a lot of people's feathers because it indicates a divinity or when everything, but for the physicists out there who are agnostics or atheists, let's call it the zero-point field. Same stuff. What name you want to use is up to you. The consciousness is transduced via ORMES in these materials. The collagen and connective tissues are just laced with ORMES, very high concentrations, as well as the neuron microtubules, and they provide different functions. The connective tissues get that information from the biogenic and morphogenic field, bring it down, tell every cell in your body how to construct itself, what it's supposed to do, how it's supposed to operate from that information field in the higher dimensions. And it takes care of your body's physiology, construction, and function. The microtubules in the neurons take the ORMES and use that for information transduction from the who you are in the higher realms and higher dimensions and put it into your brain. These are little side portals and so on that go into nerve cells, and the ORMES conducts that information from those higher dimensions, who you are, where you came from, what you're all about, puts it in your brain, and your brain lets you have the physical senses that you have that you run through the world with. And basically that's the difference between the two, but they're very similar functions. The functions, again, are intercellular communication, intracellular, inside the cell tells itself what to do. This is what says one cell tells the other what it's doing and how to coordinate, and all that's communicated from the morphogenic field or biogenic field according to Mei-Wan Ho and Sheldrake. And it's involved with a lot of things. How does your body keep going on a day-to-day basis, especially in Western cultures, the way we abuse bodies, the way we do, and we're proud of it. It involves DNA repair, and there are some eloquent studies later on that show how DNA is repaired. One of the main agents used in chemotherapy is cisplatin, I think. In any event, what it does is it goes and destroys DNA. So the DNA that's sending the wrong instructions for tumors and things like that to form is wiped out. It's just destroyed. It doesn't go and destroy the bad segment, it destroys everything in sight. Now how can that DNA reconstruct to tell the tissues what it's supposed to be doing? And it's because of the morphogenic field. That information is already out there. It's communicated. That DNA strand is rebuilt, and some eloquent research on how that happens occurs. We'll get into that again in detail later on. My goal is to generalize it first and then bring the evidence and the research into play that validates what I'm telling you. So you don't need a PhD to follow me. You can get the twist of it, and if you are a doubting Thomas and you want the information for the research, it's there and available. So it forms a scaffold of the matrix of consciousness. We talked about that through the brain microtubules. The morphic field is extra-dimensional to the third dimension. The physical body and so on is intradimensional down in here. Another really important thing about these ORMES is they're inert. They are not consumed in body processes. Things that are consumed in body processes are usually broken down or dumped overboard, and they need to be replaced constantly on a daily basis. Try going without water for more than a few days, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Things that are not consumed stay in place for the most part. The ORMES is lost from the body mostly because dying or diseased or rupturing cells release, and the body carts off the detritus. But for the most part, they're stable in the body. They have antimagnetic, we talked about that, with electromagnetic force interactions. And a really good example of that, and I'm not going to even look at you guys because I don't want to see you all cringe, but the amount of brain tumors and ear periphery tumors in the past 10 years has gone through the roof. I've heard estimates from 5 to over 15 million a year at this point, and I don't have the specifics on that, but there's a lot. Now, where the heck are these tumors coming from? You got a thing in there called the Meissner field that's anti-magnetic. All the ORMES in your ear and the cells have these Meissner fields around them. They don't like magnets, and you put a cell phone, which is an EMF magnetic generator, against your ear, and you hold it there for hours and hours, and you talk to your friends and so on and so forth. What's happening to the ORMES? It's being displaced and forced out of the cellular structures that it's supposed to be in. And when that happens, the DNA can't be repaired because it's intimately involved with DNA repair later on, and so tumors start. So magnetism and anti-magnetism are really important in these realms. And your cell phone, sometimes it's a good idea to put on speaker and put a little bit further away from your ear. Some of those are defensive mechanisms. There are also devices that are tuned magnetoelectric antennas. Brian out there has a whole slew of them that distort some of that field and reflect it back, and they may be beneficial. So, and there are other devices, you'll see them, stickers for your phone and all kinds of stuff. Many of them I don't have any idea if they do or don't work. So your body does need sourcing of these materials to replenish what you've lost in your breakdown tissues as the cells are destructed. There's some recovery apparently, but Western agricultural techniques in particular are very deficient in the NPK, the chemical fertilizer format. The plants do not pick up ORMES like they're designed to. So when you eat plants that are deficient in it, you're just not getting it. Well, organic has a little bit more, but organics is, nobody really knows what the heck organic is because it has a lot of wiggle room for not getting the plant to assimilate and do the things he wants. Biodynamic foods or DMIT are better, but home gardening, if you do that, look into biodynamic methods, things like that, they increase ORMES uptake. And we're going to talk here in a little bit about where certain ORMES are sourced from, so you can supplement if you choose to. So again, we talked about the mechanism of human consciousness in some detail. Your physical body is built out of physical constituents that most people would term matter down here. Still energy, but it's in a dense, what we call solid form. So the ORMES is in the quantum coherent state. Its job is tissue information mediation. I should put information in there, to mediate information of what those tissues and cells are supposed to be doing in the organs, how they're organized, and high concentrations of ORMES substrates, especially in the gel-sol binary functions, are mediated by the connective tissues, and we'll show you a little bit more detail in a minute. A really interesting story. One of the things that I have heard that triggered Mei Wan Ho to start and take a deep breath and say, what's wrong with this picture? Is she was watching a table tennis match. And as she was watching this table tennis match, she's just sensed something's wrong. What's wrong with this picture? She's watching the action for 5, 10, 15 minutes. These it was during the Olympics, were carrying on this table tennis without a miss. I mean, it just goes on forever. And you know, I can think of better ways to spend an afternoon, but she couldn't. In any event, she's sitting there and she realizes those paddles and the actions are happening way faster by magnitudes than neural conduction can allow for. Now, nerves are supposed to tell your hand and muscles what to pick up, where it is, how to position itself. It's outstripped by magnitudes of speed. Where's this information coming from that tells that paddle where to be? So she starts her research quest, and we'll talk about some of the specifics here as we go in. But she realized right away the nerves can't be responsible for information, total information transfer in the body, which is the classic biological model. The gel-sol binary state is how this information is mediated by her research, and the connective tissues are much faster in transmission than neural. Remember, in spooky action, faster than the speed of light, instantaneous, no time barrier distance, the information is there immediately in coherent systems. Very high concentrations of ORMES in neural tissues, and we're going to talk about this more in detail later, but there's a term called an operator in quantum physics. And it's not like the gal who sits behind the old-fashioned phones and says, number please, and all of that stuff. In quantum physics, to kind of oversimplify things, things are the way they are because a wave function is in force. And when the wave function is collapsed, it defines what's going on at the moment. It defines what's called an Eigen State. Something, if you want to change from what's going on now to something else, there has to be something that changes the collapse of the wave function. And the thing that does that is called an operator. And there are lots of things that can do that. But one of the most critical that we're going to talk about is, and I think Bob Boyce brought this up yesterday, if you don't believe something is going to be effective, it's not going to be, because human consciousness is an operational operator. It makes things happen. And this is where belief systems come into play, so on and so forth. Without getting too divergent, you got the left brain and the right brain. The left brain's job was to filter information because the right brain knows everything. It's connected with the universe. The left brain says, that's too much information. That's overload. I don't need all of that stuff. What do I need? And it's from very earliest childhood, the baby's there flailing, doesn't know anything about what it can do, but it knows everything in the universe. From that point on, as it grows, the left brain is constantly asking questions. Is this valid for me? Is it important? Is it beneficial? And if it's not, it filters it out. And if it is, it allows it in. And it comes into how cultures exist, how children are raised. All these different things put these left brain filters into place, and it totalizes as what's called a belief system. And there are a lot of things you guys are believing. The reason most of you aren't levitating right now, bored as you are, is because you believe gravity's going to hold you down to those seats. So that's an extreme example, but the bottom line is this is a potent material or potent force. And more as conscious expansion occurs, more and more people are controlling their own destiny by getting rid of those left brain filters that aren't beneficial for them, and allowing the right brain information that comes from the higher sources to permeate through. All right, so some of the inert gas and material relationships. People have proposed that the inert materials are really already in an ORMIC state. And I don't buy that. I think they're in a pre-ORMIC state because it's a progression. On the periodic table, on one side you have all the normal elements, then on the right side you have the inert elements, and then the ORMES would be put into place. So it's a transition from what you would call elemental chemistry into inert chemistry, which exists. Doesn't like to, but it can be forced into it. And then the ORMES, which says, not today, sorry, I'm busy. So I think it's a transitional, ORMES are in a transitional position to what I would call the right side of the periodic table, on the right side of the transitional elements, inert elements. And this is important later on because we're going to talk about there's strong building evidence that when you put, we already know, when you put inert gases in an electric field, they light off, they illuminate. Different colors. You can see open, you can see cores for sale. You got the whole 9 yards. In a magnetic field, they seem to take on different properties, and you'll see why, I hope, in a little bit.
The magnetic fields induce these and engage these pre-ormic conditions in a way that it distorts their behavior. And there are some designs coming up that basically, if they're implemented, of high pressure inert gases in a high Gauss magnetic field, have the projection to project a beam that can destroy cancerous cells, thought forms, things like that. So, and cancer really is a thought form in the quantum way of looking at it. It's just got its own way of doing stuff. It has elevated itself at least one level of priority in biologic dominance. And so a cell will take on the validity of a tissue, or the tissue will take on the validity of an organ, and it'll override the normal architecture and relationships. So some of the implications are, if ORMES are involved in wider consciousness, does a mineral have consciousness? Well, if that mineral material didn't have consciousness, how's it going to design and construct itself into a crystal? It's got to have some way of translating that information into its chemical composition. So if we look at this list in increasing order of complexity, each one has a domain that it exists in that is defined in that realm, or it wouldn't be in that realm. So for minerals, their consciousness would be crystal architecture. For plants, we're jumping a few, there's a few in between the bacteria and fungi and stuff, but anyway, plants come to a higher set of architecture, and they behave a lot like minerals, but they also behave a lot like animals in certain ways, kind of intermediate. Animals, human, you keep going up. As the consciousness goes up, self-awareness becomes much more critical. There are some people that say animals have self-awareness, but if they do, it's rudimentary and it's not to the extent that humans do from all experimental evidence. What about the planet? It's kind of up there high on the list. Does this planet know it's alive? A lot of people say yes. So here's the quantum architecture that says that's a plausibility. So they're all dimensional interface materials in the ORMIC realm, and they transduce information from the fourth to the third, and there's probably a feedback mechanism involved. So what other interface connections exist? ORMES, for the most part, are confined to what we call the precious metal or platinum metal group, and so on and so forth. And you'll see a list of them here in a little bit. But these ORMES are chemically inert. Where the heck are they, and why are they there? They like the idea of tetrahedral structures and probably cubic structures. But they like to think they're little dogs, and they hide in the doghouse. It's a nice place to hide. Nobody bothers them. So they are located in tetrahedral and in and it doesn't have to be a crystal. It can be a lattice. It can be a tetrahedral lattice instead of a tetrahedral crystal, or a cubic lattice. They've got a space to hide. So when we precipitate these things, we look for them where we've found them before, and it tends to be in these kind of lattices. You can get natural precipitation from nature. Milky quartz, the milkiness in that is probably ORMES that was kicked out of their dog houses and optically changed the transparency. What about the whiteness of clouds? Let's think about this for a minute. It's proposed that high UV concentrations, high in the atmosphere, cosmic radiation, magnetic fields, lower atmospheric pressures all contribute to precipitating, and this is parallel to some of the ways that we precipitate ORMES down here for our own collection. It's conjectured that these ORMES precipitate out, and that's why clouds are white. Well, any truth to that? If you've ever looked at a cloud, especially at various times of the day, except really low flat light conditions from either horizon, there's a thing called a rainbow that you see with all these different colors, and it's in the arc and the whole 9 yards because it goes through water droplets, it spreads the light, so on and so forth. Why doesn't that happen? Why don't the clouds have little on their puffs, have little rainbow colored boundaries, things like that? Because the angular displacement of that cloud gives you every angular displacement you could imagine from your viewpoint. They're really should be some colors out there, and usually there's not. So it may very well be that the whiteness in clouds is from precipitated ORMES. And John Maluski took it a step further and goes out into the desert, especially on the lava beds and the basalt, and their little cups and cup-shaped formations from the lava bubble stuff collect water, rainwater. And over the years, you can go out there where it's been relatively undisturbed, and there's a white film or a white boundary layer of powder in these little cups. And he would collect that, and we'll show you in a little bit some of the results that occurred from that. But it's high in ORMES. Where's that ORMES coming from? It's coming from the rain, and the rain comes from clouds. Gee, seems like there's a plausibility for that to occur. Here are the known elements. I'm just going to run through this list real quick. It's on the record if you need it. These are the ones that are known to form ORMES state. And it's probably because of their shape. Back again in that lead beater, it needs to be in a columnar, kind of something you can flex. Here are some of the things that biologically interface that are known. M state iridium, and M state ORMES, ORMUS, and M state are all the same thing. And so when we talk about M iridium, we're talking about ormic iridium. And what it was monatomic iridium, but monatomic in the high spin state as opposed to atomic. Biologically, medically, it speeds metabolism. The evidence is you can get it at a precipitated Pacific sea salt in about these concentrations, Great Salt Lake salt, about these concentrations, but don't go and throw your bucket in a Great Salt Lake. It's full of pollution. Get your salt from the Redmond salt beds that were Great Salt Lake salt beds from a millennia ago or more, and it doesn't have the modern pollutants in it. M rhodium affects thymus and neurologic tissues and communication, 5% in dry ash weight of a brain. So if you borrow somebody's brain and you dry it down and you burn it into ash, you're going to get about 5% M-state ORMES in that. Sources are aloe, varic, tea. It can be precipitated at a Great Salt Lake salt or the Pacific Ocean at 30%. And many of the sources have multiple ORMES components in them. The one exception seems to be the gold. In the Dead Sea, it's about 70% gold ORMES, and I don't know what else is in there, but that other 30% has never been defined as other ORMES. It's administered as pure gold ORMES. And it seems to affect longevity, DNA repair, anyway, knowingness, more awareness, wider envelope of consciousness and attunement, and a lot of people have said deeper spiritual attunements. We're not supposed to say that in a scientific realm. Rhodium, let me see. A combination of rhodium and 70%, 15% gold, and iridium has a synergistic effect of the things that each one of these does individually, much higher than they do standalone. And it's used by researchers and people who just take it on their own volition for a wide variety of health issues in a very detailed list, and it's updated with continuous empirical research. Who's doing it? What's happening? What kind of problem did they have? It's really updated on that website, so you can get a wider feel for that. Platinum, there's a caution with alcohol. Platinum ORMES can generate an anti-abuse type reaction, so if you want to quit drinking, you have a non-prescription way of approaching it. If you don't, then avoidance is recommended. And ruthenium, thyroid and bone activity, there's much more detail on the website. I just want to kind of give you the broader picture. And palladium, sensory tissues, organ systems interfacing. So this is how the organ systems talk to one another. And silver, possible bone and teeth implications, again, probably transmit the information from the higher realms on the solid tissue type construction in the body. And those, embryologically speaking, develop much different than most other organs in the hard tissues. So that's probably why it's standalone there. The other elements, not much is known for the most part, with a few exceptions. Nobody knows what mercury, osmium, or even potentially some of the other toxic metals would do in the ormic state. If they're fully saturated and they're chemically inert, the suggestion is nothing's going to happen if you take them. Problem is, you're not going to find fully saturated ORMES in anything. There's always going to be some desaturation, and the closer you get to the 0%, the more it behaves like the metallic parent compound. And so if you get material contaminated with low saturation, you're essentially taking a metallic mercury and osmium. Not a good thing for your biological constitution. So those are probably saturation issues. Copper has been reputed to cause toxic reactions with people who have Parkinson's disease. So copper, ORMES and M-state copper is to be avoided if somebody has Parkinson's disease. So, and I point this out again to just kind of reorient us to a new way of thinking. The material things of the universe are not nouns. They aren't things, person, places, despite what people say. They're all verbs because they're processes, they're in motion, they're energy events, and all energy is in motion. So we want to keep in the back of our mind that even the most solid things are energy in motion. The question then becomes transduction from one level of energy to another. And this becomes important here in a little bit for some of the other things we're going to talk about. So the energy exists in various states. You can call it matter, you can call it ether. Those are the divergent polarities. There's all kinds of bandwidths in between, frequency bands. Important thing we're going to talk about in a minute is in this realm that we're sitting in now, we live in an electromagnetic world. Even your body's physiology is highly controlled by electromagnetism. We're going to talk about what magnetoelectric spectrum is here in just a moment. But remember, dimensionality separates at the Compton radius vortex. A really important thing to keep in mind. This 3D realm that you live in and we live in with our sensory apparatus is ordinary space-time. The etheric realm is exotic space-time. Interestingly, the reason why, up until I think the 1920s, the etheric realm was widely accepted by physicists. And Einstein came along and said, no, it doesn't exist. So everybody jumped on the bandwagon and said, nope, can't happen. And surprisingly, before his death, he reversed himself. But they didn't publish that very widely. So even Einstein, as he thought it through over a period of time, said, yeah, these exotic space-time realms exist, and we're going to talk about that more. And here's his equation. Most people know it by the E equals mc squared, and they leave it at that. This denominator basically just modifies things as speed parameters change from very slow to very fast, so that it tells the truth rather than distorts itself. So the denominator for most reasons is not important, except in this area, we're going to talk about it more. Here's real critical. This is your plot, and this is just a two-dimensional plot. The third axis is valid, but this illustrates the point. So if this is the light boundary, the speed of light, everything from here this way is slower than the speed of light. Everything from this way is faster than the speed of light on this graph. Here's the physical universe you live in, the third-dimensional reality you live in, positive space-time. We've gone through the various names of it. But as the velocity increases and hits C, what happens? In this universe, this isn't really a really great diagram because that line, those two lines never touch. It's a hyperbolic curve. It comes close. At infinity, there's an argument. Yeah, it does. No, it doesn't. Well, I haven't been there yet. I can't tell you. But the bottom line on this is this plots out that as you increase the velocity, the mass of a particle increases, and so the particle eventually gets so heavy there's not enough energy in the universe to push it any faster, and the speed of light is the boundary. And that's the world we live in and our sensory apparatus is set up for. They have known all along that that equation, when it's plotted out, generates this alternate curve here in this opposite quadrant. And the opposite quadrant from this one to this one or this one to this one, the relationship is called an inverse quadrant in mathematics. And inverse qualities are known and they can be defined based on the qualities here, because I don't want to tell anybody if I've been there or not consciously, so we're going to stick to here. So the bottom line is, what happens in this arena? And I want you to remember this little intersection point, because we're going to come back to it a few times. It fits into 3 or 4 of the flows I'm bringing you into, and it's really critical for understanding this. Here is a description of the physical realm of the known qualities. And any physicist will tell you, yeah, this is the way it is. This universe that your sensory apparatus attunes to is driven by electric monopoles. We call them electrons. The velocities are less than the speed of light. You can't reach the speed of light. E equals mc squared says that, and it's been pretty much validated. This universe that our senses attune to has what's called positive entropy, but entropy is a negative quantity. So positive entropy means you're multiplying the negativeness and you're making it badder. It's going to be worse. So positive entropy says it's going to wear down. Everything's going to wear out. It's going to spin down. It's going to slow down. It's not going to stay the way it is. It's going to deteriorate. Positive mass. Well, you guys all know about that. If you've ever been on a diet and tried to hang on to one, you know the concept of positive mass. Coherent state 1 is the quantum definition of stuff in this arena. Positive time flow. We view time as links in a chain that always moves forward. That's our sensory perception down here. We know about gravitation. It ties in with the dieting. And down here, a Faraday cage will screen these electric monopoles. So if you don't want your neighbor to hear what you're saying on telephone, you better shroud yourself in a Faraday cage, because they can tune in this day and age and pick up the signals. Well, by definition, in an inverse quadrant, we know the relationship between what is here and what should be here. In this, we're talking about magnetic monopoles. And up until about, I'm thinking about 5-ish years ago, and most physicists wouldn't admit that these existed. John Lewis got laughed off the face of the earth for 40, 50 years because he said these things exist and they're all around. Everybody said, no, it's stupid. You cut a magnet in half, you're going to get 2 smaller magnets, but they're still going to be bipolar. And it doesn't matter how small you cut them. Well, tell that to a tree, because, and tell that to your dieting, because everything that's based on green plants in this realm uses magnetic monopoles, not electrical monopoles. That's how the sugar is created in the leaf. We'll get to it if we can. What is this? Slower than the speed of light here? Faster than the speed of light here. Here's your boundary of speed of light. The lowest speed is still on this side of the speed of light, and it goes faster. So you get into hyperspeeds. Negative mass. Oh, this would be a dieter's dream. You can get out there and you not only don't weigh anything, you weigh less than that. Coherent state 2, again, just quantum physics defines things in a coherent state by certain parameters, and these fall into coherent state 2. It's just a definition. Negative time flow. So if you don't like something you did last week and you made a mistake, you can try to figure out a way to get into here and undo it, because the time flows in the reverse direction. And this comes into the space-time picture. In this world, everything is levitated and it's not screened. And coming back to the negative negative entropy here basically says you're negating a negative substance. So this basically says, instead of everything deteriorating and wearing out, it's going to go on forever. It's going to expand forever. And it's a continuum. It doesn't wear out. It keeps building on itself. Really critical to understand. And oops, what happened? Uh-oh. I've been guilty of worse. I think that was slide 33. Thank you. Anyway, back to this. Here's one immersion that you're in now that your senses don't tune into. Here's the immersion that your senses tune into, but they're coexistent. Really important later. Question becomes, how can we get stuff and information and forces, bandwidth in this arena to work in this arena? Well, green plants have solved that. They take south monopoles, absorb them into the leaf. North monopoles come out of the earth structure, go up the sap in the tree. At that interface, it is translated into energy that converts carbon dioxide and water into sugar and other carbohydrates and builds them up. But it's always been known there's way more energy in that sugar than there should be based on the chemical reaction. It's pretty much been ignored as this has. And the glitch here that really makes this different from here is this mathematically is solved by all real numbers. So we know how to deal with it and we know what the numbers mean, at least mathematically. One of the factors in this quadrant is always the square root of -1. And nobody really knows how to wrap their mind around what does that really mean? What does it translate to? How is the square root of -1 going to change or affect or determine the reality here? And some eminent mathematicians are now calling these solutions hypernumbers. Well, if they're hypernumbers and it's going faster than the speed of light, I'm okay with that. But it again ties into the inverse relationship is known from those two quadrants, and those are the things that are predictable. So people that want to work with these materials, ethers are energies that are faster than the speed of light. John Malusi calls them superlight, and they're a magnetoelectric, not an electromagnetic universe or phenomenon. And the difference is, if electricity is the component that's the major component, and it's viewed as a linear immersion, the further you go in, magnetism is like an excretion product. It's a byproduct, and it's just the overflow. It's the reverse for magnetoelectric. Magnetism is the driving force, and electrical phenomenon are excretion phenomena. They're satellite phenomena. They're not they don't originate at a driving source, and it's really important because that's a key to how you can manipulate that other realm. And nature does it to an extent. So how do you measure and transduce these kinds of faster than the speed of light energies with material things in a slower than the universe? All the apparatus that we have is built of slower than the speed of light materials, and it starts to become a problem. We're pretty sure that if you take a radio in this sensory environment we live in, you disassemble it, and you take all of those components. You have conductors. You have an antenna that takes the signal. You have conductors that send that signal to different electrical components. In an inverse quadrant, a conductor is going to be an insulator. It's going to have an inverse function. So how do you design something that takes that information, translates it into this environment, and stores it? And that's one of the things John and I were working on, and a lot of other people have been working on for a long time. We're not trying to convert that material into electrical energy. That's a dead-end route by the way we think. What we're trying to do is take that energy and use those magnetic monopoles like a tree does or like green plants do and put it into chemical energy, which then can be translated to useful form. So anyway, and ORMUS provides a major interdimensional link in these processes. It is the thing that's going to, can you go back to 33 for me, John? Or John's not there? Can we go to 33 quick? And then what's tools and practical? Anyway, this is one of the things that I didn't think I had as much time as I'm supposed to have, and as a consequence, I can go backward, but I don't want to make the audience dizzy. It should be those two hyperbolic curves. Well, let me go real quick. Anyway, okay. So this point is really critical. Look at this band and look at this band. This is a huge energy separation gap, especially as you go into the faster realms. Down here at the slower speeds that we run around town accomplishing, it even is more divergent. So how does one transduce the energy in this realm to that realm? ORMES is one of the major intercommunicators that opens up. Remember, the BEC, the Bose-Einstein condensate, is viewed by quantum physicists as being a mini wormhole. So it'll let stuff from here into here. What you do with it when it gets here is what we're working on now. So those are some of the important things that, I keep trying to tie together. So what we're trying to do is find combinations and interfaces of components with known characteristics and then target an application. And the ORMES and the BEC interdimensional port is really critical. Paramagnetic materials down here are incredibly important for that interboundary for plants and that monopole transmission. So these are a big part of some of the media that needs to be built to accomplish this. Shape and architecture, from ancient history, there are things called sacred geometries that have been passed down, and they do in fact lens. Last time I had a picture, I didn't put it on this time, of a pyramid, and going into the top of the pyramid is a double helix spiral on a Kirlian photograph. When it hits the apex, it reverses, spirals the other direction to about the king's chamber level, where it reverses again and goes out the bottom of the pyramid as it was coming in the top. Also, there are 4 side vents that flash things. What that's doing is taking some of these higher energies and transducing them through sacred architecture and all of the basic first 9 different forms of sacred architecture, from the point all the way up to the 9-pointed structures, all have different lensing capabilities. And these are going to be really important because they're going to be like the resistors and the capacitors in a radio set to alter the signal and direct it into a mode that you want it. So we're trying to access the ME energy and transduce it through these mechanisms into useful energy that we can utilize here in this realm for our own purposes. And free energy is a big part of that, because that outside etheric band is unlimited energy. Remember, negative entropy goes forever. It's a free ride, and you can have all you want if you can just figure out how to tap into it. And the plants on this planet already have. So, and the hemoglobin in your bloodstream is very closely related to that, except it's adapted to animal physiology instead of plant physiology. So, think about it. What carries all of your nutrient from ingestion? It's the bloodstream, and the hemoglobin is charged with far more than carrying just oxygen. So, probably the main way is, if you can't use that material directly or that information directly because it's way the heck too fast, very short wavelengths, you can tune in and get into resonance with it and chord it down, like hitting high C on a piano and listening to low C vibrate or vice versa. You're stepping down the energy through a resonance system that allows you to achieve lower energies than the source. Or it can go the other way, but so, and then don't forget the quantum operator, because if you don't believe it, it's not going to happen. Bob Boyce really hit that home yesterday, and it really struck home. So what are some of the applications? We can go into parent element recovery. That's what John and I started working out on at first. And somewhere over here, I have, and I'll show it to anybody who wants to come up, is a 6-gram button of gold. We precipitated that and collected it out of 2 brown beer bottles. I'm not going to tell you the brand because I don't want you to flood them. Anyway, and I'll show you how we did it up here. That's about $330 worth of gold at $1,100 an ounce. There's no gold. If you spec beer bottle, there's no gold in it. You can crush it, powder it, put it into any chemical environment you want, and there's no gold in that bottle. That's metallic gold, but there's ORMES gold, because why? It's a tetrahedral lattice, silicon dioxide. Where do those little dogs like to hide? In the dog house, inside of the tetrahedral crystal or lattice structures. If it's not crystalline, glass isn't crystalline, but it still has tetrahedral lattice structure to it. So We recovered that. And if I ever had any doubt, listening to John Malusi being way out there saying all these things that, are you kidding me, John? You know, what, you know. Anyway, when that happened, I'm a believer because I have it right in my pocket. These things fold into health, medicine, and agriculture as the main communication mechanism from the implicate order, the morphogenic fields, down into whatever it is, plants, human beings, your dog, your cat. I don't want to be prejudiced, so I'll throw cats in there too. So really related to health relationships. Etheric energy transduction. John Maluski's superlight. How do you get that faster than the speed of light? And some of this stuff books along. There have been estimates that some of this are going 10 billion times the speed of light. So if you want to get somewhere fast and you can hitch a ride, go for it. But how do you take that kind of energy and transduce it down into a slower than the speed of light universe that's way slower at our realm where we function? And these are the things we're working on with these inverse qualities. Conductors here are insulators there and vice versa. And we've probably got the antenna systems down pretty darn good. And we've got some of the intermediary components pretty good. But it's a matter of phasing and matching the signals. An FM signal in an AM radio isn't going to do you much good. So you get into these kind of realms where there's a lot to be filtered out, but the principles are there and we're working through them. And John Malusi is an absolute futurist genius. And he sees things 40 and 50 years out in the future that he was laughed off the face of the earth 40 and 50 years ago, and they're there now. So it gives us a good target to aim for because you're not just randomly searching for things that may not be. He sees the reality of what's out there. And remember, in superlight realms, negative time flow, so he can move around the universe and check things out, and he seems to have that ability. So anyway, in quantum physics, physical applications, they can be used in computing. That's already being attempted. And dimensionality, it can help define and is defining dimensionality at all the different quantum levels, right from wherever we are in the sub levels from here all the way up into what's called the 0-point field. Not a good name, but we got to talk about something. Expanded consciousness, the envelope can be expanded by utilizing a mechanism and a media to bring more information down into the brain and the via the morphogenic field into human existence. So there's a lot of room for investigation here. And it may end the argument between a lot of people of is there a God or isn't, call it whatever you want. 0-point field God, unlimited, undeveloped, unlimited potential energy. Nothing exists, but everything's potential. Does it really matter what name you put on it if that's the way the mechanism comes down? So, talk a little bit more about how you can recover some of this stuff, or at least manipulate it. In the book that I showed you in the earlier slides, there are dry and wet precipitation methods. They're chemical methods, but we said, geez, this is chemically inert stuff. It's not the ORMES that's being precipitated chemically. What happens is the analogy that was used, if you wanted to go out and collect all of the female dogs in Albuquerque, you could snatch them up one at a time, you could do your best at it, and you're going to have trouble. But, I'm sorry, the other way around, all the male dogs. But if you get a female dog in heat and put it on the leash and just walk down the street, you got a pretty good following. And that's what's happening here. When you precipitate some of the alkaline materials, calcium hydroxide and magnesium hydroxide are the big ones, through a hydroxide precipitation, you're dragging these things along with you, or with them, because they don't have any better place to go. And and we're going to show you here a magnetic tube picture in a moment of how it works, and it's easier to explain than verbally. So how do you get from the parent metal to the M state? Well, Hudson found out a carbon arc burn of 300 seconds pushes it over into the ORMES realm. And it relates to the etheric field, the morphogenic fields at that point. And surprisingly enough, again, remember I said the pyramid is a lensing system, had the vortex, reverse, and so on at the king chamber. Someone had one of those pyramids you put over your head, and they hung a gold coin from a string at the king chamber level. And we're fiddling around, I don't know, got a phone call or this or that or whatever, came back, forgot about it a few weeks later, and the coin's coated with oil, an oily substance. High saturated ORMES tend to behave and look like oils. You can drive them out of a beaker by putting a magnet on one side. They'll tunnel right through the glass and create an oily streak running away from your magnet. They're really slippery substances to work with. But in any event, so you can get in there and deal with these things. Apparently, the pyramid and its subtle energies and transducing those is convincing the gold that wants to go back, the metallic gold that wants to go back into the ORMES state. So that's another method that has pretty much been proven. And there's a lot more detail in that website. I'm just giving you anchor points that you can really flesh out if you have an interest. Now, how do you get from the M state back to the metal conversion? How you get the $330 worth of gold out of 2 beer bottles. And usually I buy them by the 6-pack because I have high hopes. But anyway, so I'll show you a little bit more about that, but basically we use a pulsating energy field that's electromagnetic, and remember what I said? All ORMES are in a Meissner field. They're all in quantum coherence. So if you can impress enough electromagnetic energy and magnetic component against the Meissner field, you'll break it down. And when you break that field down, it goes out of the coherent state and it reverts back to the metallic state. The trick is, and a funny thing here is, how far do you drive these things? Either direction. If you're bringing them from the parent metal back into ORMES or from the ORMES to the parent metal. John Malusky had a really interesting experience. We did a run one day, and there they were. They're glass beads, and they tend to precipitate out. If you do it right, you'll get a glass bead of gold and silver alloyed that's about 85%. Then you'll get another bead, and they get smaller in 4 or 5 bead distribution. And one of the beads is just, it's just lustrous. So what we're thinking is we're getting gold, platinum, iridium, so on as a distribution if you do it right, and you can isolate them separately. Well, he had this beautiful distribution. He took a photo of it, everything's just wonderful, and Ethel, his wife, was screaming at him saying, "It's time to go to sleep, John, you need to take care of your health." You know what wives do. Anyway, so he finally says, okay, time to do that. So he goes to sleep, gets back in the morning, can't wait to get at the little dish, and there's nothing on it. It's gone. Where'd it go? What happened? Well, apparently what happened was during this process of pushing it over, he started to push the saturation from the 10 state down to the 1 or 2 or 3, but he didn't get it to the 0 state. At the 1 or 2 saturation state, 10%, 5, 15%, something like that, it looks metallic, it behaves metallic very largely, not totally, but largely. And there was enough ORMES that was saturated there, enough components that were saturated that said, hey, what are you guys doing? We're supposed to be over here. Come on back. And they did. So that's it. They all went back into the ORMES state. So it was a slick learning lesson. It's $330 down the drain, and we're funding all of this out of our own pocket. So anyway. So what you're doing is you're collapsing the Meissner field, you're overpowering it by excess energy with a high magnetic component, and the electromagnetic energy we were using microwave ovens generated the heat where we could get the stuff into we use various methods of recovering it, fire assay techniques, and we use glass distribution techniques and that sort of thing. So it's a translation via energy, and the pulsating energy fields is mandatory. It has to get those molecules flexing and tear those bonds apart. And microwave bombardment was the method we were using. Here's the microwave setup. This is insulation, and inside of this insulation, this is a top plate, but the rest of them have holes in them that are creating a hollow cylinder. And we put materials in crucibles and things like that, depending on the technique we used. And we were working out the time temperature parameters when John ended up moving back to North Carolina. And as a consequence, okay. So in any event, there we are there. So if you want more information, John's card is outside. If you buy the slides, it's on there. Here's your magnetic vortex. The way this thing works is, remember what we said, ORMES does not like a magnetic field. So you run water, and there's ORMES in water. So you run water into this tube, which is a clean, free discharge, except it has a magnetic cylinder on the outside. So water can free flow. But the ORMES coming down here says, whoa, wait a minute, I don't want to go through that. You go through that. And Mikey says, no, I'm not going to do it. Forget it. So they concentrate in this area. And depending on how small of a hole with how tight of a filter you can put in there, they've got a pretty good stream coming out here, but it really should be more like a drip, 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 and you collect it. You get a high concentration of water with ORMES in it, and then there are other ways to concentrate it, magnetic fields, things like that, where you can drive it out, stuff like that. So anyway, actually, can we flip it onto here, John? Yep. I'm just doing this. I won't be able to read it. I don't have enough time, I don't think, maybe for a little bit. But no, not 33 on the but I want you to have a written record of this, and it defines some of the research that Mei-Wan Ho, no, not my slide, on your ViewMaster here. Yep. Okay, so now you got it in print if you buy the, these are some of the research areas. If I have a minute or two, I'll actually read a little bit to you. And then, here's the continuation. And the top line, I've written it in print. It's a double repeat because it's split on the printout. But essentially, that should be enough time for somebody to freeze a frame if they buy the DVDs later on. But I'm just going to try to, and so Mei-Wan Ho says, the instantaneous non-local coordination of body functions is mediated by, let me see, not the nervous system, but by body consciousness inherent in the liquid crystal continuum. The collagen fibers are a liquid crystal continuum in the gel cell state. Implicit in this suggestion is the idea that living systems have a special kind of coherence or wholeness, which is characteristic of macroscopic quantum systems. Big guys, you, all out there. And then she later elaborates, I have argued that quantum coherence is the basis for conscious experience, which involves the possibility of non-local communication. I'm going to skip down a little bit because that's kind of some fluff in there. The possibility from which has been said above is that memory is not only delocalized over the, let's keep going, entire brain, but over the entire liquid continuum. So your consciousness isn't just localized in your brain, it's through your whole body, but the brain has a different job of translating your senses into consciousness than your body. Your body's more concerned about how do I stay together and how do I work. Your brain is what am I up against, that sort of thing. So, and then you can continue on later from the actual reading of that if you want. But it drives the point home that non-local infrastructure transduced into your physiology keeps you alive and lets you know who you are and whether you got your hand on a hot stove or not, et cetera, and so forth. So, now we need back to the slides. So anyway, we find that the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. There's a lot of people out there,
always trying to do this. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. A guy named George Bernard Shaw said that. This is something that I really want to bring out, is the strength of the human race lies in the individual differences of everybody out there, not in our similarities. If we had everybody being an Einstein or a PhD, I know PhDs that can't tie their shoes, and I'm serious. They may know what they know really big time, but it's the compilation of the differences that allow us to build the infrastructure of where we are today. And this is really something I really like to drive home. We need to learn how to be tolerant and say, you may see it differently than me, but maybe you have a point. Maybe there's some validity. At least let me look it over. And in conclusion, this is John Maluski. Only those who are willing to attempt the ridiculous can achieve the impossible. And he has spent his whole life doing that. Okay, questions and answers, I presume.
Hello there. Okay. Hey there, John. You were talking about how to detect those energies that are faster than light. Consider this, a mixer.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part.
A mixer.
A mentor.
Mixer.
Oh, a mixer.
Like you use two frequencies.
I'm
Mix
open
them
to
together.
suggestion.
Okay.
Let's keep it going. Say it loud enough. So what I want is somebody out there to pick up information from what I said and start doing stuff. And there are a few people doing that.
You get a higher mix order.
Mentor.
Mix order.
Yes.
And a lower mix order. Products.
Okay.
When you're above the speed of light, you get a high mixed product, which is even higher, and low mixed product, which is below.
Okay. Yeah, and don't you guys forget that.
All right. Thank you very much. John Rahart.
Okay. Anybody with any additional questions, I'm here for your edification. I'll tell you